All right, hello everyone. So I'm so excited to be joined today by Dr. Iain Campbell. Iain has a PhD in global health from the University of Edinburgh, and he is currently working as a researcher specializing in metabolic psychiatry at the University of Edinburgh. He was the co-principal investigator of the very first European trial of a ketogenic diet for bipolar disorder, which published some of its findings already this past fall. And he also helped to establish the Metabolic Psychiatry Hub at the University of Edinburgh, through which they are also working on commencing a randomized control trial on the efficacy of the ketogenic diet as a treatment for bipolar disorder. So all of that is really exciting, but an additional kind of incredibly valuable and unique attribute that Iain brings to this work is his own lived experience of navigating his own bipolar disorder. So I am so excited to have you here with us today, Iain. Thanks so much for agreeing to be interviewed on the channel. I'm so excited to hear more about your story and your work.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me on the show.
So I guess just to dive right in, can you maybe start off by sharing a bit more about your own personal journey with bipolar disorder and maybe how you discovered the ketogenic diet as a potential treatment?
So for me, kind of in the early years of living with bipolar, I wasn't approaching it from a scientific angle. I was just trying to kind of survive it. And one of the ways I kind of engaged with bipolar was with music, because I couldn't understand these kind of emotional range and swings that would happen compared to other people, compared to people around me in high school and in primary school. And the way I kind of engaged with that was to actually write and compose music and to try and describe this experience, because I felt it was so kind of unusual and it seemed odd compared to how my friends were. And my mood swings kind of got more and more severe over time. And I think my music probably got more eclectic over time. But I actually started off working in the music industry. I worked for Universal Music for Darkest Beast, who was the president at the time, as a recording artist called Kid Adrift. And I called myself that because I was trying to understand this kind of stage of life where I didn't understand my illness, and I was trying to find ways to conceptualize it. And so at the time when I went to mental health care, when I looked for help for mental health care, I was told this is an imbalance of neurotransmitters in the brain. It's kind of all about neurotransmission. And so I actually wrote songs about neurotransmitters, which is quite embarrassing to think about now. But this was one of the ways I tried to engage with the illness, was to try and understand it through this kind of scientific lens that I'd been given. And as time went on, my episodes became sort of more and more severe, and I realized there's something physical about this condition. I'm sure you can relate to this, that there's something that's not just, it doesn't feel like neurotransmitters explain this enough. There's something very physical to depressive episodes where it almost feels like you've been running in a marathon, and, you know, even scientifically, the lactate in your bloodstream is building up, just like someone who's exhausted from running or someone who's engaging in high intensity exercise. And it's that kind of odd feeling of, you can be lying down and completely immobile for almost weeks at a time, but you feel exhausted and there's no relief from that kind of depression. So I really knew there's something more about this than what I've been told about it. And so really, to finding ketogenic diet, I went through like a very sort of dark time in life, which I was saying that I'm low-key one of Rob's biggest fans, because I also have a very supportive partner in going through bipolar, and I know what a big deal that is. And my wife really helped me in surviving this period of my life, and my father. And but I decided I'm going to do everything I can try to be well, and I had no idea that physical health could have any bearing on mental health. It just wasn't in my paradigm. I was like, this is an imbalance in neurotransmitters in my brain. Only medications can do anything meaningful to that. And so I went on a kind of very strict Atkins type diet, which was essentially a ketogenic diet. I was doing the kind of, I got the Atkins diet book, and I was, doing all the recipes and eating vast amounts of, ham and bacon and whatnot. And to my amazement, I was losing weight for the first time. I'd never been able to. And I lost about 40 pounds over the first few months. But I remember also the first time I experienced the mental clarity. And I was sitting on the bus one day going to work, and this kind of calm washed through my mind. It really was something I hadn't experienced in a very long time. And I remember looking at nature and feeling kind of almost ripples of positive emotion that I couldn't remember were associated with nature. I'd never felt that in such a long time, to feel kind of calm and serene in my thinking. And it was really, the way I describe it is almost like the city grids, like a city grid clicking back online. It felt like my neurons were kind of powered up again. I could think, and I could think through things clearly. And all the things that were kind of driving me towards very kind of suicidal and depressive thinking, it felt like they resolved in a way that I couldn't have done logically. They were just, my brain was working enough to see them in the right perspective for the first time. So that was obviously amazing to me. And then there was no turning back from there. I wanted to understand what this is and what it meant about the illness. And so I went back to university. I couldn't actually get funding to study this at the time. Nobody was interested. This is about 8 years ago. And I tried to get support for it, but it was very kind of early days. And so I had to work at a computer game company called Rockstar Games. They make a game called Grand Theft Auto. This was an incredible place to work, and I ended up becoming the music producer for Rockstar Games. Not many people know this about me. But that was my job that I used to fund my research, and I'd work till 2 a.m. Not advisable to anyone with bipolar. I wouldn't recommend staying up late. Please go to bed at the correct time. But I used that time to learn, and I researched and tried to understand everything I could, and started publishing papers. And whilst working at Rockstar, I completed my PhD. And even then, after that, I still couldn't find support for this for a couple of years. But eventually we met Jan Ellison, the Bazookies, and they funded our pilot study, which was the very first project we did on this. And this is what we've been publishing and presenting at conferences recently. So that was kind of my sort of long-winded explanation of how I came, and a very winding road to ketogenic diet research.
Yeah, I mean, that's amazing. So when you first started the Atkins diet, or the form of the ketogenic diet, did you think that maybe there would be benefits to your mental health, or was it more of just a means of improving your overall health?
I had no idea this would have any bearing on mental health, because like I say, the kind of paradigm that I was in was, this is a neurotransmitter problem. And the only way you can affect that is with, things that affect neurotransmission in the brain and chemicals. And the medications, unfortunately, didn't help me tremendously. And so I always knew there was something wrong with this explanation, but I couldn't say anything about why it was wrong. And doing this for the first time, it just made me realize that mental and physical health are interrelated for the first time. And it gave me a lot of hope, because I thought, there's something I can do about this. I can make a difference to this.
Yeah. Yeah. And you talked about that kind of feeling like your brain switched on after a short while using this medical diet intervention. And I think I've had a very similar experience where, it just feels like your brain is functioning the way it's supposed to all of a sudden. And that's quite a powerful experience to go through.
Can I ask, how was the transition for yourself? Did you also experience that kind of real shift? For me, it was like, I couldn't remember what it felt like to feel happy, which is a very odd feeling. Did you experience something similar?
Yeah, I think to begin with, early on in the process, it began with just me realizing, I'm not experiencing things that would typically disrupt my experience of, reality, whether it's hallucinations or whatnot, and realizing that I wasn't experiencing that anymore. And then, it did kind of become more like a bit of a cloud or a veil was being lifted, whereby I could connect with the world around me and with my own emotions and thoughts in a way that didn't seem possible for the longest time, or that felt more difficult for a really long time.
It's so odd, isn't it? And I think that there's so many things about normal life that generate happiness, looking at nature, spending time with family. And often I think bipolar kind of takes that away, where you can be in those situations, but you're kind of behind this glass wall and you can't experience it. And I guess I felt for the first time I can experience those emotions, which was really interesting. And it was a long journey to kind of find, how to make this work properly and what ketosis was and so forth. But it kind of gave me those positive emotions again, which was fantastic. Yeah.
So, you shared that you were a music composer and that was your career and whatnot. So I'm curious to hear more about how you made the switch into the research world and kind of dedicating your career to, moving forward this metabolic psychiatry idea and movement.
Yeah. So I guess the links between bipolar and kind of wanting to have a creative expression for go back in history, and I think everyone with bipolar to some extent, feels that kind of impulse to have some creative outlet, because you're experiencing such a wide emotional range that you feel the need to express it in some way. And so that was just always how I kind of cope with having the illness. And it kind of also allowed me to work when I was up, and then when I was down, I would be not able to function, but I would at least be able to make some music when I was kind of in the up periods, and that would allow me to make an income and survive. And so I did that for about 10 years. I worked at, there's this recording artist called Keto on Universal Music, and then I worked briefly as the assistant to a film composer. And then eventually, but during the time I was well at Rockstar Games, but it was just the only way I could live, because I didn't have the ability to work in a 9 to 5. I'd be completely useless in an office. I couldn't do almost anything like a normal job, and I was just this sort of a strange person with bipolar. So you really have no options in some ways. I mean, I had no options at that time to have a normal job, so I had to try and find other ways of surviving at the time. And the first time I've been able to be functional and consistent is since doing my PhD, and I work at a university, and it's still amazing to me that that's possible. You know, I really have never been able to hold down a kind of job like that until I've been in ketosis and be able to have kind of consistent energy.
Yeah. I mean, I have a similar experience where I had to create a YouTube channel career because I couldn't function in the regular 9 to 5 either. But yeah, kind of wondering how the capacity shift now after kind of healing your brain a little bit more and having a different experience using metabolic therapies can open up new possibilities.
It's kind of ironic how people with bipolar can end up in really cool jobs, like having YouTube channels and I don't know if you saw Heston Blumenthal, the chef, came out as bipolar this week. He's like a really famous chef, a Michelin star chef in the UK. And for the first time, he shared that he's bipolar, and it makes so much sense now, the way he's kind of, the creativity he's put into his cooking and his kind of work. So it's funny how they find ways. Do you think that means that people with bipolar, you know, some people see it as just a disorder, but there's many like positive aspects, like obviously you've brought into your work and into your career through it. Do you see those positive aspects as well of these conditions? You know, that it's obviously devastating in so many ways, but do you also see those positive aspects in your own life?
I do, yeah. I mean, it's brought forth, you know, more compassion and empathy, but I also think that when your brain works a little bit differently, there's that like neurodiversity element to it as well, whereby it opens up different ways of thinking about the world. And so perhaps opens up new ways to move through the world. And it is difficult to function within the confines of our society that is very based around neurotypical functioning. And, you know, it can feel like you can't succeed because your brain is working a different way. But I do think that there is room to kind of reframe that understanding and see more of the positives of a brain that works a little bit differently.
I always like to be reminded of that because I think so often people kind of feel I certainly did, like you just feel like you just don't fit in the world and you're not designed for the world, and maybe, you know, you're not meant to be, you know, and so many times maybe you're not meant to be in the world. And so it's always encouraging to feel that there's something about this. And the kind of genetic researchers in bipolar have a kind of consensus that there is this kind of, it's not just, it's clearly devastating and needs to be treated and is a disorder, but the kind of genetic researchers see the prevalence of it in the population, how it remains in the population at a stable rate, kind of quite a surprisingly high rate for something so serious. And so, you know, maybe there's aspects of it that can be beneficial, but our modern environment just puts so much pressure on those same, good aspects of it. Our diet and our light and exercise and so forth is not optimal for us to thrive. And so I see many people, you know, now when they use ketosis as a therapy, really thriving in their career and in their family life and social life in a way that they wouldn't have done otherwise. And it feels very promising compared to obviously the kind of sedation of some aspects of medication that I've experienced, where you're able to kind of live, but there's no, you know, substance in life in the same way as there is when you're really kind of thriving and contributing in some way. So I hope ketosis can help people to find that kind of quality of life.
Well, I think that makes like a good point about maybe perhaps the problem with where mainstream psychiatry is, where it's just kind of trying to subdue and, you know, dampen symptoms or elements of the illness rather than focusing on how to encourage that individual to thrive. And yeah, I agree that my experience of going through ketosis as a medical intervention for my schizoaffective disorder has really shifted that more toward focusing on, okay, how can I thrive with this illness or this disorder? I'd love to hear more about your clinical trial that you just did. And I'm wondering if you can elaborate on the findings from your pilot study of the ketogenic diet for bipolar disorder and maybe share some of the most significant outcomes that came from that.
So we did a prospective pilot study of ketogenic diet for bipolar disorder with 27 bipolar patients, and we put them on the ketogenic diet for 6 to 8 weeks. And throughout that time, we measured their symptoms, their depression, mood, and so forth. We took metabolic parameters like their weight and their BMI, blood pressure, and we also did detailed metabolomics, which are kind of blood tests with hundreds of readings, and brain imaging, so MRS brain imaging, magnetic resonance spectroscopy, to look inside the brain and see what's changing, what's happening to the neurochemistry and metabolites in the brain. And so it was quite a comprehensive pilot study to try and see what are the purpose of a pilot study is to establish the feasibility and safety of the intervention for people with the condition. And then the kind of secondary outcomes is to look for what it does to people and does it have effects on their mental health and physical health. And so it was very encouraging because in this pilot trial, we measured their ketone level every day and we measured their mood symptoms every day. So mood, energy, anxiety, and so forth. And at the end of the study, and you can see this in the preprint we've recently published, you can see there's a correlation between the ketone level and improvements in mood, improvements in energy, reductions in anxiety, reductions in impulsivity. And this is something that is really never been seen in psychiatry as a blood marker that would correlate to any kind of communication about the symptoms of an individual. You can't really measure something that shows mental health symptoms moving in the blood. So this was really interesting, but it was the concomitant physical and mental health benefits that are most surprising, because the current paradigm obviously of treatment is many of the medications we take sacrifice some of your physical health for your mental health. You often put on weight on second generation antipsychotics and have metabolic dysfunction. But we were seeing the opposite. In fact, 95% of the participants lost weight, and the maximum was 22 pounds or 10 kilograms, which is whilst taking their normal antipsychotic medication. And the mean weight loss was 4.7 kilograms. So this was showing that their physical health is improving alongside their mental health. And we also showed in brain imaging that glutamate, which is one of the most, if you read kind of systematic reviews of bipolar disorder, metabolomics and brain imaging studies, glutamate always comes out as the most affected metabolite, certainly in brain imaging. Is kind of raised and elevated in bipolar, and it's an excitatory neurotransmitter. It also shows up in epilepsy. So this kind of excitation of the brain is a feature of bipolar. And we saw this come down quite substantially in 2 out of the 3 brain regions that we scanned. And this was really interesting because it shows that we're moving something that was only thought to be possible through kind of medication. There's some indications of light therapy, reducing glutamate in the brain. But we saw that just through 8 weeks of a ketogenic diet, we reduced brain glutamate quite substantially. And we looked at this kind of compared to previous studies of anticonvulsants and anti-seizure medications that are used in psychiatry. And it was a comparable, in fact, it was a larger reduction than we'd seen in previous studies. So although this is a small pilot study, these are really promising indications that this can be helpful for people. And I've shared the patient experiences of people on this trial, and many of the patients have said this substantially improved the quality of my life. This allowed me to go back to work or reconnect with my family. And not everyone responds this way, and we won't know until we do larger trials what percentage of people this might be. But there's certainly a group of people in our trial. At the end of the trial, we asked everyone to come off the diet and to discontinue it. And over a third of the participants actually said, we won't come off this diet because it's really helping us. So we had to readjust the protocol somewhat. And it's quite remarkable in a trial for patients to do this, to say that we're not going to come off of this treatment. So we continued the treatment with these participants, and many of them continue to thrive and be in touch with us and do really well with it. And I've been playing some of these experiences at conferences. So I think that the kind of the hope of this study is that there might be a way that we can improve physical and mental health at the same time and not sacrifice one for the other. And ketone level certainly seems to be important in achieving this. But the other aspect is we won't know who this can work for and how many people this will work for until we do larger RCTs. And this is our next step, is to do large RCTs to try and understand could you predict who would respond to this, and what percentage of people might respond to this? We know about a kind of, a third might respond to lithium, and a third somewhat, and a third not. In epilepsy, there's kind of similar rates, but we want to find out who can benefit from this and to what degree.
Yeah, I mean, that's amazing, just the preliminary results. But as you mentioned, RCTs, randomized control trials, are kind of the gold standard in terms of scientific studies and whatnot. So that's very exciting that you are working on getting that off the ground. Can you maybe share a bit more about what that will entail?
Yes. So the kind of, it's always interesting because I personally obviously have experienced these benefits, and so I'm very motivated to research this. And part of me wants to tell other people, that they could reduce their suffering. And so I'm kind of, but at the same time, as a scientist, I want to channel this through the best evidence that we can generate to change practice in psychiatry and in guidelines for people. And my motivation for that is because when I was about 15, when I first saw a psychiatrist, it was really, unfortunately, there's so many amazing psychiatrists, and I have so much respect for everyone that works in that field, but it wasn't a positive experience for me. It was a very negative experience, actually. And I wish that I'd been told about this when I was 15. It could completely change the trajectory of your life. And people with epilepsy know this because if you put a young person on the ketogenic diet for 2 years very strictly, a significant proportion, maybe over 50%, will have no seizures for the rest of their life. So you can do this intervention at a young age and actually really alter the course of illness. And I appreciated very much your video about when you said, I wish I'd known about this earlier, because I had the same feeling of like, oh my gosh, how could things be different if you learned about this at a young age? So I'm really motivated for young people when they go into their psychiatry, see a psychiatrist for the first time, to learn about this information. And the way that we can do that in the UK is to change things like the NICE guidelines, change the care practice guidelines for psychiatrists. And if they are educated about this and know about this and present it as an option, maybe we can avoid a lot of problems for a lot of people from as young an age as possible. So RCTs are the kind of evidence that we can move the needle with. And so we want to do a large RCT. This needs to be powered highly enough to influence these kinds of guidelines. In the UK, it's the kind of NICE guidelines. In the US, I think, the APA define the guidelines. And so we need to get sort of 300 people studies, but these cost about £4 million to do. And we're making remarkable progress in getting this done, which did not look to be the case 2 or 3 years ago. There was actually no funding in this field, and it was entirely because of the Bazooki's funding pilot trials, funding research in this area, and really reinvigorating the field. Because of their personal experience also with their son Matt, they went through the same story, and this is something that he'd been, in every possible treatment for 5 years, tried everything under the sun, and this was what made it better. So much like us, they really wanted to see this researched and done. So we're now hurtling towards RCTs of ketogenic diet for multiple mental health conditions, which is really brilliant and very exciting for the field. Major universities starting research projects in this, and so people like Shibani Sethi in Stanford have just published their pilot trial, and so it's really moving at quite a pace now. And I think this is just very promising for the future of this kind of research and treatment.
I'm very excited to see all of the emerging evidence that's coming out around it. One thing that I did want to ask you, though, is that it kind of seems that there is often a degree of disconnect between researchers and clinicians and the patient's lived experience. And so I'm wondering, as someone who kind of lives on both sides of this equation, do you have any insights on how to potentially better bridge this gap?
Yeah, so it's kind of a rift that I think goes way back into psychiatry. And there was this kind of initial rift in psychiatry between this kind of, it was like Emil Kraepelin, who was one of the kind of founding, he's kind of thought as one of the founders of psychiatry. And then there was Sigmund Freud, and they took kind of these different paths where Sigmund Freud said, this is all about how your mom treated you, and Emil Kraepelin said this is all about the biology of the brain. And they took these, sorry to oversimplify the whole field of Freudian psychology, but they took very different paths. One was kind of psychological in nature, and the other was biological in nature. And there was tremendous optimism at the time that they could solve mental illness through the biological mechanisms. But Freud was actually a neurologist by training. He trained as someone who wanted to explore the biological mechanisms, but he saw that we weren't making progress. And he gave up and went down this route of psychoanalysis. And this is how this was a big split in psychiatry, where the camp that were focusing on the biological basis and the camp that focused on psychoanalysis split for a long time. And it created a kind of divide, not only between psychiatry and neurology, but between physical health and mental health, because there was people who remained with the idea that we can fix this through physical, biological mechanisms. And there's a camp that thought it was all about counselling and psychoanalysis. And so down through time, this led to different university departments, different funding streams entirely. If you go to a university, they have separate centres for physical health and mental health entirely. And so really there's no interaction. But, I'm sure, I don't know if people know, but there's this fantastic thing called the neck, somewhat connecting the brain and the body together, it seems. And we've kind of overlooked how much of a connection there is between physical and mental health in science. And so this is now coming back together. And the thing, to answer your question, that is remarkable about this is it's coming through lived experience, like yourself, sharing your experience with how improving physical health is improving mental health. Because in academia, there's these very clean lines of distinction between physical and mental health, and we kind of have a department for this and a funding stream for that and a research project for this. But when you're a patient, you experience the whole interconnected reality of living with a mental illness, which is physical and mental health problems at the same time. And so I think it's because of our lived experience coming into research that this is now coming back together, that we're seeing disciplines re-engaging neuroscience and psychiatry, physical health sciences and psychiatry. And this is what metabolic psychiatry is about for me, is using patient perspective to reconnect these disciplines again.
Yeah, and yeah, that's a really great explanation of it. And I think something that I kind of found too, kind of having navigated the research world briefly in my career, was that qualitative data was often scoffed at.
Yes.
And, quantitative data was kind of the gold standard and was true rigorous science. But, I really love that, you were sharing, the experiences firsthand of people who are in your trials, as well as part of the body of evidence that we need to be looking at. Because, the lived experience of the qualitative data is so important in terms of understanding the full picture too.
Totally agree. It seems like if you're treating someone, you want to speak to that person and hear them describe how they are in their words. It seems like, isn't that part of being a human, is wanting, if you're helping someone, to know that it's helping them in their own words. But because we focus so much on pharmacological drug trials, which obviously have tremendous value and can be life-saving for people, but because there's been such an incredible focus on that, only the objective quantitative measures have come out in trials, and many as you know, many of the treatments we have are kind of suboptimal, where you live in this very sedated state, unable to kind of contribute into the world in the way that you'd like to. And if you ask people about that qualitatively in these studies, it doesn't look good for those treatments. And so I think qualitative data coming out of metabolic psychiatry is really notable, because it's like, what are the patients saying in their own words, and are they really better? Can you sit down with someone and tell that they're a thriving human being that feels that they're contributing to the world and able to live a life that feels meaningful to them? And that's what I see in patients coming out of metabolic psychiatry trials, is this kind of improvement where it's like, this is a thriving, happy person, I can tell. But there's no way to quantitatively necessarily capture that in the same way we have with drug trials. So I totally agree that qualitative data will be a big part of this movement. And so, and much like you shared your life experience, I'm constantly showing your videos to people in our department and sending them to people as you go on the journey of ketosis. And it's so powerful because you documented like 5 years of your experience before doing this, and you can see the incredible journey that you went through, and all the difficulties with it, and also the integrity with which you shared your experience and accuracy. And so it's hard to ignore when people experience this kind of transformation, and it's so clear that they've accurately conveyed their experience. So it's really powerful for moving research, sharing experience. So thank you.
I mean, thank you as well. So the next question that I wanted to ask you was, about your own experience and how that interplays with your professional life. So your Twitter bio is Bipolar Mind, researching the bipolar mind, which I love. And I'm wondering, if or how your professional work as a researcher has perhaps also influenced your own personal management of the condition. Yeah,
so I'd be really interested to hear about your experience as a researcher also, because I read a book by Kay Redfield Jameson, and it was really encouraging to me because she describes all the difficulties of being someone with bipolar trying to work in an environment. And she was on treatment with lithium at the time, and that was a real challenge for her getting through the academic research. And I think objectively, I feel a lot more well than I think, I guess, when I reflect on my experience when I was working in music, I was really unwell, and I can totally relate to the struggle of being that unwell and trying to just survive each day at a time, one day at a time. And I think that I think that we live in a time now where people are much more understanding of lived experience, and that's very fortunate, because in the kind of 1970s or 80s, there wasn't this kind of patient prioritization, whereas now there's many departments that have lived experience experts in them, guiding the research, informing the research. And it's something I'd recommend to anyone. If you have a mental health condition, you can provide such valuable experience. You know, people talk about getting a PhD or a master's, but it's like, try living 20 years with a mental illness. You become an expert in that in a way that nobody can imagine. And so that is incredibly valuable to research, to share that experience. So you can reach out to universities, to research departments, and offer to share your experience. And it is hugely valuable. And for some people, it can even be a career and a job. We employ people at the university, like a whole team of people from all over the world that have lived experience, to share their experience and to and we find it one of the most valuable things we ever do.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting how it all interplays when you kind of live in both spheres. And I know that my work, even on this, like, probably research work too, but even just exploring the illness more through our YouTube channel has definitely impacted how I manage my own condition, just in terms of, you know, increasing my own education and insight into my illness. So it's interesting how, you know, operating in both worlds can improve your ability to cope with the condition too.
Oh, if you don't mind me asking, how did you find academic research? I know you shared about it on the channel, but how did you find it being an academic environment? Was it supportive, and were people interested in lived experience, or was it challenging? Or
it was very, very challenging. I was in a health policy research program, and trying to move through that, but focusing even on mental health. And I think I was quite astonished at how unaccommodating or how unaccepting of the lived experience that environment was. And I disclosed my illness, and I ended up kind of just getting pushed out, you know, even in that environment that is supposed to be, you know, helping people who are living with mental illness or mental health conditions. And I found that in various other spheres too, where I was working in health teams and whatnot, like literally serving people with mental illness. And when I self-disclosed my own experience, I would kind of get pushed out of these teams, or, you know, there would be not very much accommodation in terms of the difficulties I was facing trying to stay in this role. So I guess that's a question I have for you too, is, you know, you have self-disclosed quite publicly, and I'm wondering if you faced any of this kind of stigma or anything navigating a professional career as a researcher in this sphere too.
Yeah, it's one of the funny things about disclosing mental illness is it isn't always very easy, is it? You know, you'd expect that maybe the world would just kind of immediately, but with so many other conditions, if you have cancer or if you have diabetes or anything, there's a huge degree of understanding, but there's not the same, and it is changing hugely, and that's fortunate. And I still always find it hard sharing my experience, because I noticed that it puts a filter between you and people, where it's like, instead of them just seeing you as a human being, it's like you're this human being with this filter that is bipolar disorder on top of it. And there's a kind of level of analysis of, like, you know, they're probably always to some degree wondering if you're well or if you're healthy or so forth. And that is difficult with social life and with work life. I've found it to be massively positive doing it, which I didn't expect. But I still sometimes feel like I've walked out on the edge of a plank a bit and feel like, oh gosh, like, let's take a step back. When I talk publicly about it, we moved to a new town recently in Scotland with my kids, and you realize that people, if someone was to Google you or to, you know, to try and find out about your career, they're going to see that you live with this mental illness. And the first time you meet them, you wonder, what do they think about me, and what do they make of that? And will this inhibit my ability to settle into community? Will it affect my kids, like in their nursery? So it's still a difficult thing, but ultimately I just felt it was worth it, because something really helped me and nobody was experiencing this. And I felt like it's almost like I feel like I have a responsibility to people with bipolar to share if I really do find something that works. And this has become much more than I ever expected, the level at which I'm sharing it. But I think I feel that it's worth it for every time someone gets in touch and says that this has been beneficial for them.
I mean, yeah, I just wanted to kind of validate that feeling of, I think you sharing your story and dedicating your career to improving the lives of other people who are navigating similar illnesses is incredibly valuable. And so thank you for that.
Thank you.
So you mentioned briefly that you are starting out the Metabolic Psychiatry Hub at the University of Edinburgh, and that sounds very, very exciting. And I would love to hear more about what that's looking like and what that entails.
So this was really exciting because we applied to UKRI MRC, which is it's like the NIHR in the UK, and the kind of largest funder of medical research and the most kind of influential funder of medical research. They funded many over 20 or 30 Nobel Prize winning projects, including the discovery of DNA by Francis and Crick, and things that really moved history in terms of scientific progress. And every university gets one application from the whole university to put forward to these schemes. And then you are in competition with all the other universities in the UK to get funding. So it's really the most intense funding process you can imagine. And we managed to get ours through from our university, so which was amazing because this is a new field, and the university put us forward as the most promising. And then we managed to get down to the top 10, and we thought, oh, surely we're not going to make it through. This is only a couple of years old, this field, but actually it has such deep scientific roots and need from patients, the neuroscience and the kind of metabolism and mental illness, that I think they really appreciated that this is something that needs to happen now, is this physical health and mental health interface. And so we got funded by the MRC, co-funded by Bazooki Group, to research all the genetic links between metabolic health and mental health. We're doing large trials, prospective trials. We're doing sort of a small rapid prototyping of metabolic interventions that will roll into larger trials, and ultimately want to do a large RCT of ketogenic diet for bipolar disorder. And so we've got kind of a whole breadth of kind of research on this that will be really impactful over the next 5 years, and in all aspects of this, we're having patients guiding the process. So we have a group of patients that are steering the research and making sure it's always towards patient benefit, which is we're really excited about.
Great. I mean, I'm really excited to hear what comes of this hub in the next few years. I guess I just want to end this with asking, what advice would you give to someone considering the ketogenic diet as a therapy for their mental health condition?
So I think I think it's one of the most exciting times to be working in mental health and looking at treatment. I really do believe in my soberest thinking that in the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to understand these conditions and treat them in ways that we've never found possible before. And I think part of that is through the advancements we're making, understanding the mechanisms. You can see even on PubMed now, the kind of rate of pace of psychiatry research is increasing, and remarkably, this is thanks to metabolic psychiatry and the Bazooki's kind of kickstarting this field. But also with the developments in AI, we're really going to have so much more capacity to understand this in ways that we haven't been able to before. And so I think it's a really hopeful time. And if you're suffering from these conditions, please hang on and wait for these developments in treatment that we're making. And one of the ways people want to engage with this even before, or some people will inevitably want to try this. As a scientist, I want there to be RCTs and all the evidence and understanding of how to do this properly, but people can approach their psychiatrist, and that would be the advice from everyone in this field, I think, is to approach your psychiatrist and discuss it with them, and to work with people who are trained in this area, dietitians, if you're going to do this, because there are, as you've documented on your blog, there's so many interactions and medications that need to be managed and complexities to doing this. So please do, if you want to try this, reach out to your psychiatrist, work very closely with them, and find people who are knowledgeable about this field and who can guide you. There's very well-trained dietitians in the epilepsy service in the UK and in the US who can guide you in doing this. So please work with people who are knowledgeable about this, and I really hope that this is beneficial for people who want to do this. And in the meantime, we're going to keep trying to understand how this works. Can you predict who this works for, and generate the science around what will allow us to kind of refine this and make it available to people and deliver it in the best way possible. But please do, if you're suffering and you're in a dark place at the moment, hang in there, because the research is really moving at a good pace now, and we're really going to make a lot of progress in the next 5 years in treating these conditions.
Well, thank you so much for all the work you're doing to move that research along. And thank you so much for joining us today. I loved hearing more about your story and the work that you're doing. And I think it'll be really valuable for our audience to hear too. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for all you're doing to raise awareness about this condition. And I'm a huge fan of the channel. It's a real privilege to be here. Thank you.
So if people are looking to hear more from you, where can they find more information about your advocacy work or your research work?
So I have a podcast called Bipolar Cast, where myself and Matt Bazuki interview patients and their experiences on ketogenic diet. And it's just lots of people that have done ketogenic diet and they share their experience with the diet. And we have a website for the Metabolic Psychiatry Hub called metabolic psychiatryhub.com.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much again, Iain, for coming on our channel and sharing your experience as well as the work you are doing around metabolic psychiatry. If you want to learn more, check out the Metabolic Psychiatry Hub website at metabolic psychiatryhub.com. If you want to hear more from Iain, he also hosts a podcast with Matt Bazuki on keto and bipolar, which you can find on the Bipolar Cast YouTube channel. They share interviews with other individuals who have used ketogenic therapy to treat their bipolar disorder, and they also share interviews with experts and clinicians around the topic as well. Thanks so much again, Iain, and thank you to everyone for watching this video. As always, wishing you and your loved ones good health, and we'll see you in the next video. Bye.